The clinking of crystal and the low hum of predator politics filled the Obsidian Estate's grand ballroom. At a cramped table by the kitchen doors, Freya Sterling kept her head down, praying the solstice banquet would end before the highborn wolves noticed her frayed hem. She was an afterthought, a disgraced outcast meant to blend into the shadows. But then, the music abruptly cut off. The royal procession halted right beside her chair. The devastatingly fierce Alpha King stood frozen as his mother, Queen Dowager Eleanor, grabbed his forearm, her eyes fixed entirely on Freya. "Son," she murmured, the silence carrying her voice like a gunshot. "That's your fated Luna." The annual solstice banquet of the North American Lichen Council was less of a celebration and more of a ruthless, velvet-draped battlefield, held at the historic Obsidian Estate, a sprawling Gothic mansion nestled deep in the damp, pine-heavy forests of the Pacific Northwest. It was the one night a year where bloodlines were paraded, alliances were forged in shadowed alcoves, and weaknesses were mercilessly exploited. Freya Sterling sat at table 42. It was the furthest table from the elevated royal dais, positioned so close to the swinging kitchen doors that she could smell the sharp tang of copper from the raw steaks being prepared for the Alpha Guard. She adjusted the sleeves of her emerald green silk dress. It was a beautiful gown, technically a vintage piece she had spent 3 weeks restoring by hand, but next to the custom couture worn by the daughters of regional alphas, it screamed of her poverty. She wasn't supposed to be here, or rather, she didn't want to be here. 10 years ago, the Sterling name carried weight. Her father, Arthur Sterling, had been the lead tactician for the former Alpha King, but when a rogue faction breached the northern borders, resulting in the death of the old king, the blame was swiftly and brutally pinned on Arthur. It was a frame job orchestrated by the powerful DuPont family, but the evidence had been too neatly planted. Arthur was executed, her mother died of a broken heart shortly after, and Freya, then only 12, was stripped of her rank and banished to the outer edge of the territory to work as a lowly botanical apprentice. She was only at the banquet tonight because of a royal decree from the new reigning monarch, Alpha King Daniel Rochester. Daniel had mandated that every unwed female of age within his territory attend the Solstice Gala. The council was pressuring him to take a mate and produce an heir to stabilize his volatile reign, and the banquet was essentially a glorified high-stakes cattle call. "I didn't think security let strays past the outer gates." Freya stiffened. The cloying scent of heavily sprayed jasmine and expensive champagne washed over her before the speaker even materialized. Cassandra DuPont. Cassandra was the daughter of the Eastern Ridge Alpha, the very man who had signed Freya's father's execution order. She was tall, statuesque, and dripping in diamonds, wearing a blood-red gown that looked like it cost more than the greenhouse Freya lived in. Cassandra was also the woman everyone in the room expected Daniel Rochester to announce as his chosen mate by midnight. "Good evening, Cassandra," Freya said, keeping her voice carefully neutral. She didn't look up from her half-empty water glass. "Rule number 1 of surviving as an outcast. Do not engage the apex predators." "Is it?" Cassandra purred, leaning against the back of the empty chair next to Freya. She swirled the amber liquid in her crystal flute. "It feels rather insulting to the rest of us. We spend months preparing for the Alpha King's consideration, and they force us to share breathing room with a traitor's spawn. Tell me, Freya, did you sew that dress yourself, or did you steal it from a dead human's estate sale?" A few of Cassandra's sycophants, lurking just behind her, snickered softly. Freya finally lifted her chin. She had her father's striking silver-gray eyes that unnerved people because they looked entirely too observant for a servant. "It's a mandate, Cassandra. If you have an issue with the guest list, take it up with the king. Though, I imagine you'll have plenty of time to whisper your complaints into his ear later." Cassandra's smile tightened into a sneer, her canines flashing just enough to be a threat. "You have a sharp tongue for an Omega. Enjoy your night by the kitchen, Sterling. Take a good look at the dais. That is the closest you will ever get to power again." With a flick of her wrist, Cassandra deliberately tipped her glass. A splash of cold champagne hit the sleeve of Freya's emerald dress, leaving a dark, spreading stain. "Oh, clumsy me," Cassandra mocked, turning on her heel. "Try not to drip on the marble." Freya clamped her jaw shut, her hands trembling in her lap. She grabbed a cloth napkin and dabbed fiercely at the silk, biting the inside of her cheek so hard she tasted copper. "Just a few more hours," she told herself, focusing on the rhythmic, calming beat of her own heart. Midnight comes. He chooses Cassandra. The mandate is lifted, and I go back to my herbs. Suddenly, the ambient chatter of 400 werewolves died in a wave. It wasn't a gradual fade. It was instantaneous, as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. The heavy oak doors at the top of the grand staircase had opened. The Alpha King had arrived. Daniel Rochester did not walk into a room. He claimed it. Standing 6'4", with shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the entire Lycan Council, Daniel radiated an aura of dominance that made the inner wolves of everyone present whimper in submission. His dark hair was immaculately styled, but there was a feral edge to his sharp jawline and piercing amber eyes that no bespoke tuxedo could ever tame. Beside him walked his mother, the Queen Dowager Eleanor. Eleanor was a legend in her own right, frail in body but iron in spirit. She leaned heavily on a silver-tipped cane. Her right eye was clouded over, milky white, the mark of a moonseer. It was said she didn't just see the world, she saw the threads of fate that held it together. The string quartet in the corner frantically shifted from pleasant background music to the traditional royal processional anthem. Daniel and Eleanor began their descent down the stairs, flanked by 4 massive elite guards, including Daniel's second-in-command, Declan Hayes. Freya kept her head bowed respectfully, just like everyone else at her table. But as Daniel reached the bottom of the stairs, a strange sensation washed over her. It started as a spark at the base of her spine, a sudden, inexplicable warmth that radiated outward. Her pulse kicked up, skipping a beat before accelerating into a frantic rhythm. Her acute sense of smell, usually overwhelmed by the conflicting sense of the crowd, suddenly tunneled. Through the perfumes, the roasted meats, and the floor wax, a new scent pierced her senses. It was intoxicating. Petrichor, the smell of rain on dry earth, mixed with cedarwood and dark, spicy amber. It was the most comforting and terrifying scent she had ever encountered. Her inner wolf, which had been dormant and subdued for 10 years, suddenly clawed at the edges of her consciousness, howling a single word. Mine. Freya gasped softly, gripping the edge of the table. No, 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 no. This was impossible. The mate bond was a fairy tale, a biological rarity that occurred maybe once in a generation. And even if it were real, the moon goddess would never be cruel enough to tether a disgraced outcast to the Alpha King. As the royal procession moved through the room, making its way toward the dais, Daniel's pacing abruptly slowed. He was 50 feet away, but Freya saw the exact moment it hit him. His broad shoulders hitched, his amber eyes widened, scanning the room frantically, his nostrils flaring as he dragged in a deep breath. The raw power leaking from him spiked, causing several low-ranking wolves nearby to physically drop to their knees under the oppressive weight of his sudden aggression. Daniel's eyes locked onto the back corner of the room. He locked onto table 42. He locked onto Freya. The air crackled with invisible electricity. Freya couldn't look away. For a second, the entire banquet hall fell away, leaving only the crushing intensity of the Alpha King's stare burning into her soul. He began to walk toward her. He ignored the path cleared for him. He ignored Cassandra DuPont, who was standing near the front, wearing a practiced, seductive smile that faltered as he strode right past her. Daniel moved with the predatory grace of a stalking wolf, his gaze never leaving Freya's pale face. Freya's heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. She stood up, knocking her chair back with a loud clatter that echoed in the silent room. She wanted to run. Every instinct screamed at her to flee into the forest, but her feet were cemented to the floor. Daniel stopped a mere 3 feet from her. Up close, he was terrifyingly beautiful. His chest heaved against his tailored suit, and a low, possessive rumble vibrated in his throat. "You," he breathed, the word rough and jagged. Before he could close the final distance, Queen Dowager Eleanor stepped beside him. The old woman's blind eye fluttered, while her good eye fixed sharply on Freya. Eleanor didn't look at Freya's stained dress or her worn shoes. She seemed to be looking straight through her skin, into her spirit. Eleanor reached out, her frail, claw-like hand gripping Daniel's thick forearm. "Son," Eleanor murmured. In a room full of werewolves, a murmur was as loud as a shout over a loudspeaker. Everyone heard it. "That's your fated Luna." A collective gasp rippled through the ballroom. Cassandra DuPont dropped her champagne glass. It shattered against the marble floor. A sharp, violent sound that broke the spell. Daniel stiffened. The romantic haze of the mate bond, the primal urge that had dragged him across the room, violently clashed with the cold, hard reality of his rational mind. He recognized her. He recognized the silver eyes of the man his father had executed. "Sterling," Daniel spat, the word dripping with sudden venomous realization. Freya flinched as if struck. The intoxicating warmth of the bond shattered, replaced by the freezing reality of who they were. Daniel took a step back, tearing his eyes away from hers, his expression hardening into an impenetrable mask of pure ice. The political implications raced through his mind. A king could not mate a traitor's daughter. It would cause a civil war within the council. The DuPonts would revolt. It had to be a trick. A trap. "No," Daniel said, his voice carrying the alpha command, echoing off the high ceilings. "The seer is mistaken. This is a deception." Eleanor's grip tightened on his arm. "Daniel, do not defy the moon. The thread is tied." "I am the king!" Daniel roared, the sound shaking the crystal chandeliers above. He pointed a trembling, furious finger at Freya. "This woman's bloodline is poison. She is a Sterling." He turned to his head guard, his chest heaving as he fought his own screaming instincts. "Declan, take her to the holding cells in the lower levels. She is to be detained for questioning regarding dark magic and manipulation of the royal family." Declan Hayes stepped forward, looking torn, but he could not disobey a direct alpha order. "Wait, please!" Freya cried out as two guards grabbed her arms. The rough handling sent a jolt of protective rage through Daniel, making him bare his teeth and step forward, only to forcefully stop himself, his hands balling into fists at his sides. "Take her out of my sight," Daniel commanded, turning his back on her, though his whole body shook with the effort. As Freya was dragged through the swinging kitchen doors, humiliated and terrified, the last thing she saw was Cassandra DuPont stepping smoothly up to Daniel's side, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder while shooting Freya a look of absolute, triumphant malice. The descent into the Obsidian Estate's holding cells was a jarring transition from opulence to despair. The air grew instantly colder, trading the scent of roasted duck and expensive perfumes for the harsh metallic tang of damp stone and old blood. Freya stumbled as the heavy iron door clanged shut behind her, the sound vibrating through her bones. Declan Hayes, the king's second in command, released her arms with surprising gentleness once they were out of the public eye. His broad shoulders were tense, his jaw ticking as he looked down at her. "I apologize for the rough handling, Freya," Declan said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble echoing off the subterranean walls. "You know how it is. The Alpha's command cannot be challenged in the Great Hall." "I know, Declan," Freya whispered, rubbing her bruised wrists. She had known Declan when she was a child, back when her father was still a respected tactician. He had been a young recruit then, eager and kind. "But you know I didn't do this. You know I don't possess dark magic. A mate bond cannot be forged by a witch's hex." Declan sighed, running a hand over his closely cropped hair. "I know, but King Daniel has the weight of the entire North American Lycan Council on his neck. The DuPont family has been threatening to pull their financial backing, specifically their shell company, Silverton Reyes Logistics, which funds half our border security on the Olympic Peninsula. If he mates a Sterling, the Eastern Ridge Pack will declare civil war." He ushered her into a reinforced cell at the very end of the corridor. It was stark, containing only a metal cot and a small grated drain in the floor. "I'll try to talk sense into him once the adrenaline wears off," Declan promised, his eyes filled with a heavy, reluctant sympathy. "Just stay quiet. Don't provoke anyone who comes down here." The lock engaged with a heavy, final click. Freya sank onto the cold metal cot, burying her face in her hands. The adrenaline was draining away, leaving behind a profound, hollow ache in her chest. The mate bond, now fully awakened and violently rejected by Daniel, felt like a physical wound. It was a phantom tether pulled taut, burning her from the inside out. "Sterling." The voice was a dry, scraping rasp, like dead leaves dragging across concrete. Freya's head snapped up. The sound had come from the adjacent cell, separated by a thick wall of iron bars. She crept closer to the partition, her silver eyes adjusting to the dim, flickering fluorescent light in the hallway. In the shadows of the neighboring cell sat a man. He was shockingly emaciated, his skin pulled taut over sharp cheekbones, his hair long and matted with filth. But as he shifted into the sliver of light, Freya saw the faint, scarred outline of the Royal Guard tattoo on his exposed collarbone. "Who are you?" Freya asked, her voice trembling slightly. "My name is Ryan," the man coughed, a wet, rattling sound. "Ryan Montgomery. I was the gatekeeper on the night your father supposedly committed treason." Freya's breath hitched. Ryan Montgomery. She remembered her father speaking of him, a loyal, steadfast soldier who had mysteriously vanished the week after her father's execution. Everyone assumed he had gone rogue. "You've been down here for 10 years? She breathed, horrified. "Alpha DuPont made sure I disappeared," Ryan rasped, dragging himself closer to the bars. His eyes were wide, desperate. I heard the guards talking. I heard them say a sterling was brought down. I saw your eyes when you walked past. You have Arthur's eyes. Ryan, what happened that night?" Freya gripped the cold iron bars, her knuckles turning white. "My father didn't let those rogues in. He couldn't have. He loved the old king." "He didn't," Ryan confirmed, his voice dropping to a frantic whisper. "It was DuPont. Alpha DuPont orchestrated the entire breach. He used the Silverton Reyes trucks to smuggle the rogues past the outer perimeters. He wanted the old king dead to install a puppet monarch. But why frame my father?" "Because Arthur found out," Ryan wheezed. "Your father discovered the smuggling ledgers. He was going to present them to the council the very next morning. DuPont acted first. He opened the gates, let the slaughter happen, and planted forged communications in Arthur's study. I was on the gate. I saw DuPont's men cut the perimeter wires. When I tried to report it, they took me. They locked me down here, beneath the radar, keeping me alive only to occasionally torture me for the location of Arthur's proof." Freya's mind spun, the pieces of a decade-old nightmare finally clicking into place. The proof, the ledgers. "Did my father hide them?" "Yes," Ryan said, reaching through the bars with a trembling skeletal hand. "He told me he hid them where the wolves of the council would never think to look. He said he buried them at the roots of his greatest creation." Before Freya could ask what that meant, the heavy iron door at the top of the dungeon stairs groaned open. Heavy, purposeful footsteps began to descend. "Quiet," Ryan hissed, scrambling backward into the darkest corner of his cell. "The king is coming. Do not tell him about me yet, Freya. His inner circle is compromised. You don't know who you can trust." The scent hit her first. Petrichor, cedarwood, and the dark, spicy bite of amber. It washed over the stagnant air of the dungeon, sending a jolt of pure, instinctual electricity straight to Freya's core. Daniel Rochester stepped into the flickering light of the corridor. He had discarded his tuxedo jacket, his white dress shirt unbuttoned at the collar, and the sleeves rolled up to expose the thick, corded muscles of his forearms. He looked unhinged. The composed, untouchable Alpha King from the ballroom was gone, replaced by a predator fighting a losing battle against his own biology. He stopped in front of her cell, his hands gripping the bars so tightly the iron groaned under his unnatural strength. His amber eyes burned with a mixture of raw fury and undeniable, agonizing longing. "How did you do it?" Daniel demanded, his voice a low, lethal vibration. Freya stood up, refusing to cower. "I didn't do anything, Your Majesty. I attended your mandated banquet. I sat where I was told. I bled over the silk of a dress I can't afford just to appease your council." "Do not lie to me," Daniel roared, striking the bars. The deafening clang made Freya flinch. A mate bond with a traitor's daughter? It's a statistical impossibility. The DuPonts warned me there were remnants of the Holloway Coven working in the outer territories. Tell me what hex you placed on me. Give me the counter curse, and I might let you live. "You are blind," Freya shot back, her own anger finally shattering her fear. She stepped right up to the bars, standing merely inches from him. The proximity was intoxicating. Every nerve ending in her body screamed to close the remaining distance, to press her hands against his chest, to let her wolf submit to her fated mate. "You are supposedly the most powerful alpha in North America, yet you let the DuPonts feed you lies while they hold your leash." Daniel's nostrils flared, his eyes dropping to her lips before snapping back to her eyes. He was breathing heavily, his chest rising and falling in jagged rhythms. "Watch your tongue, Omega. I am not an Omega. I am a Sterling," Freya said, her voice dropping to a fierce whisper. "And my father was framed. The very people you are protecting, the people you are considering marrying into, they are the ones who murdered your father." Daniel froze. The air between them grew dangerously still. "What did you just say?" "Your father's death. My father's execution. It was a coup, Daniel." He used his given name without thinking, and the sound of it on her lips made his pupils dilate until his eyes were nearly black. Alpha DuPont orchestrated the breach. He used his human logistics company to smuggle the rogues. My father found out, and he was silenced. "Lies," Daniel growled, though the absolute certainty in his voice wavered. "You have no proof, only the desperate stories of a disgraced bloodline." "I can get the proof," Freya pleaded, pressing her hands against the cold iron, intentionally mirroring where his hands gripped the metal. "Just give me time. Let me show you." A sharp, metallic shink echoed in the corridor. Daniel's head whipped around, his acute alpha hearing picking up the sound a fraction of a second before the attack. A guard, one of the men Declan had left stationed at the top of the stairs, was suddenly behind them. The man wasn't holding a standard-issue baton. He held a sleek, heavily modified crossbow, loaded with a silver-tipped bolt. "Sorry, Your Majesty," the rogue guard muttered, his eyes cold and dead. "Alpha DuPont sends his regards. The girl cannot be allowed to speak." The guard pulled the trigger. Time seemed to slow. The bolt tore through the damp air, aimed directly at Freya's chest through the bars. Daniel didn't think. He didn't weigh the political consequences or the logic of protecting a supposed traitor. His inner wolf, completely consumed by the driving, violent need to protect its mate, took absolute control. With a feral roar, Daniel lunged sideways. He threw his massive body between the bars and the incoming projectile. The silver bolt struck Daniel deep in the back of his right shoulder. He grunted, a harsh sound of pain as the toxic silver immediately began burning his lichen flesh. But he didn't fall. Spinning with terrifying speed, Daniel reached out, grabbed the rogue guard by the throat, and slammed him brutally against the stone wall. The sickening crack of the assassin's neck breaking echoed through the dungeon, and the man slumped lifelessly to the floor. Daniel staggered, his hand flying to the bolt embedded in his shoulder. Silver poisoning was fast, aggressive, and incredibly painful, even for an Alpha King. He dropped to one knee, his breathing ragged. "Daniel!" Freya screamed, her hands reaching through the bars. "Keys! Check his belt for the keys!" Daniel gritted his teeth, his amber eyes clouded with pain. He fumbled blindly at the dead guard's waist, his fingers slick with his own blood, until he found the heavy iron keyring. He tossed them toward Freya's cell. They slid across the stone, stopping just within her reach. Freya snatched them up, her hands shaking violently as she jammed the key into the lock. The heavy door swung open, and she dropped to her knees beside him. "Don't touch the bolt," Daniel choked out, his muscles spasming as the silver burned its way into his bloodstream. "It'll burn you too." "I don't care," Freya said fiercely. She didn't hesitate. She grabbed the bloody shaft of the crossbow bolt. The silver immediately seared her palms, blistering the skin, but she gritted her teeth, braced her knee against his broad back, and yanked hard. The bolt came free with a sickening squelch. Daniel let out a guttural roar, pitching forward. Freya caught him, bearing his massive weight, as they both collapsed against the cold stone floor. He was breathing hard, his face buried in the crook of her neck, and then it happened. As Freya held him, her bloodied, blistered hands pressing against his feverish skin, the mate bond fully ignited. It was no longer an ache. It was a blinding, rushing torrent of golden energy. It surged from Freya into Daniel, instantly accelerating his lichen healing. The blackened, burning flesh around his wound began to knit together before her very eyes, the silver poison neutralized by the pure, unadulterated power of a true mate's touch. Daniel's breathing slowed. He slowly lifted his head from her neck, his nose brushing against her jawline. He inhaled deeply, filling his lungs with her scent. The ice, the anger, the political walls he had built around himself for years completely shattered. He looked at her, his amber eyes clear, blazing with an ancient, possessive fire. He reached up, his large, blood-stained hand gently cupping her face, his thumb tracing the high arc of her cheekbone. "You're not a witch," he whispered, his voice thick with awe and the terrifying realization of the truth. "You really are mine." Freya leaned into his touch, a tear slipping down her cheek. "I am, and they are trying to kill us." Daniel's gaze hardened, snapping down to the dead guard wearing his own uniform. The reality of her words crashed over him. His inner circle was compromised. His father's murderers were dining in his ballroom right above their heads. He helped Freya to her feet, his hand securely enveloping hers, interlocking their fingers. The raw power radiating from him was no longer oppressive. It felt like a shield. "We need to find that proof," Daniel commanded, his voice returning to the lethal, authoritative tone of a king going to war. He looked down at her, his eyes locking onto hers. "Where did your father bury the ledgers?" "Where did he bury them, Freya?" Daniel repeated, his voice urgent but anchored by a sudden, fierce clarity. The golden warmth of their bond continued to pulse between them, a stark contrast to the freezing, blood-slicked stone of the dungeon. "I don't know yet," Freya admitted, her silver eyes darting to the adjacent cell. "But he does. Daniel, we can't leave him." Daniel followed her gaze to the shadowy corner where Ryan Montgomery huddled. The Alpha King's jaw tightened as the skeletal figure dragged himself into the flickering light. To see a once proud royal guard reduced to a starving prisoner within his own estate was a physical blow to Daniel's pride and his perception of his own reign. He had been blind. He had let the DuPonts line his pockets and stroke his ego while they rotted his kingdom from the inside out. Without a word, Daniel scooped up the heavy iron keyring. He unlocked Ryan's cell, the metal groaning in protest. "Montgomery," Daniel said, his voice dropping to a low, respectful timbre that commanded both authority and deep regret. "I am sorry. I did not know. An alpha is only as strong as his circle." "Your Majesty," Ryan wheezed, accepting Daniel's extended hand. The king effortlessly pulled the frail man to his feet, supporting his weight against his uninjured shoulder. "And yours is a circle of vipers." "Not anymore," Daniel vowed, his amber eyes flashing with lethal intent. He looked at Freya. "We have to move. If that guard doesn't report back to Cassandra or her father within 10 minutes, they'll send down a strike team. We can't fight our way up through the ballroom with Ryan in this condition." "There's the smuggler's grate," Ryan rasped, pointing a trembling finger toward the far end of the corridor, where the stone floor met a rusted iron drainage pipe. The old king had it installed during the Rogue Wars to move high-value assets out of the estate undetected. It leads directly to the auxiliary motor pool. Daniel nodded sharply. He stripped off his ruined, blood-soaked tuxedo shirt, leaving him in only a white undershirt that clung to the heavy musculature of his chest and the angry, pink scar tissue where Freya had pulled the silver bolt from his flesh. He tossed the ruined garment over the dead assassin's face. They moved quickly. Daniel kicked the rusted grate inward with a single, sickening crunch of metal. The tunnel was damp and suffocatingly narrow, smelling of motor oil and stagnant rainwater. Daniel went first, pulling Ryan along, while Freya covered their rear, her senses on high alert. The mate bond thrummed beneath Freya's skin, a steady, electric current connecting her to Daniel. Every time he tensed, she felt it. Every surge of protective adrenaline he experienced washed over her own mind. It was overwhelming, terrifying, and the most profoundly right thing she had ever felt. They emerged 10 minutes later into the cavernous, dimly lit expanse of the estate's auxiliary garage. A dozen luxury vehicles sat gleaming in the shadows. "Take the matte black Land Rover Defender," Ryan whispered, leaning heavily against a concrete pillar. "It belongs to Declan. It's analog. No GPS tracking, no royal telematics for the DuPonts to hack." "Smart," Daniel grunted. He punched the code into the lockbox on the wall, grabbed the keys and ushered them inside. He practically threw Ryan into the back seat before turning to Freya. He paused, his large hands gripping her waist. He looked down at her stained emerald dress, her blistered palms, and the fierce, unyielding set of her jaw. "You saved my life," Daniel murmured, the gravel in his voice scraping against her senses. He brought her injured hands to his lips, kissing the bruised, silver-burned flesh with agonizing tenderness. "You took a silver bolt for me first," Freya replied, her breath catching as his lips brushed her skin. "We're even." "We are far from even, little wolf," he promised, his eyes darkening. "But right now, I need you to navigate. Where are we going?" "The Ho Rainforest," Freya said, sliding into the passenger seat as Daniel fired up the roaring engine. "To the Outer Territories, the botanical sanctuary where I was banished." Daniel slammed the Defender into gear. They peeled out of the garage, the heavy tires spitting gravel as they bypassed the heavily guarded main gates, crashing through a chained-off service road that vanished into the dense, foggy pines of the Pacific Northwest. As they merged onto the desolate stretch of Highway 101, the rain began to fall in heavy, driving sheets. Daniel drove with predatory focus, his hands white-knuckling the steering wheel. The silence in the cabin was heavy, laden with unsaid apologies and the crushing weight of a decade of lies. "Arthur's greatest creation," Daniel finally said, breaking the silence as the miles blurred past. "What is it? A weapon? A vault?" Freya shook her head, staring out at the impenetrable blackness of the tree line. "My father wasn't just a tactician. He was a botanist at heart. He believed the strength of the lichens came from the earth, not from steel or politics. When I was born, he spent 5 years cross-pollinating a rare, ancient species of weeping willow with a mountain ash. From the back seat, Ryan let out a dry, knowing chuckle. "The clementine ash, named after your mother." "Yes," Freya said softly. "It's the only one of its kind in the world. Its leaves turn pure silver in the moonlight, and its roots are strong enough to crack bedrock. If my father had secrets he wanted buried forever, he would have entrusted them to the clementine ash." Daniel glanced at her, the hard lines of his face softening in the dim dashboard light. Then we dig. By the time they reached the sanctuary, the moon was high, casting a pale, ghostly glow over the mist-choked valley. The outer territories were vastly different from the manicured lawns of the Obsidian estate. Here, nature was untamed, feral, and aggressively beautiful. Freya directed Daniel down a deeply rutted dirt road that ended at a sprawling, dilapidated greenhouse complex. The glass panels were thick with moss, and the air smelled fiercely of wet earth, blooming nightshade, and pine needles. They helped Ryan out of the vehicle. The old guard was running on pure adrenaline, his eyes locked onto the massive silhouette looming behind the largest greenhouse. "There it is," Ryan breathed. It was breathtaking. The clementine ash stood nearly 80 feet tall, its massive, sweeping branches draped in long, delicate leaves that literally shimmered like liquid silver beneath the moonlight. The trunk was thick and gnarled, a testament to its deep, unyielding roots. "It's beautiful," Daniel murmured, stepping out of the car. He looked at Freya, his amber eyes reflecting the silver light. "He made this for your mother?" "He loved her," Freya said, a tight knot forming in her throat. "He loved his pack, too. And they killed him for it." Daniel's jaw tightened. "I will mount DuPont's head on the council room wall myself. I swear it to you, Freya." They approached the base of the massive tree. The roots rippled above the soil like thick, muscular serpents before plunging deep into the earth. Freya dropped to her knees, running her hands over the damp soil between the two largest roots, a spot that formed a natural, protective cradle. "Here," she said. "The soil is loose beneath the moss." Daniel didn't hesitate. He dropped beside her, his massive hands acting as shovels. With his lichen strength, he tore through the heavy, wet earth, tossing aside rocks and roots that would have taken a human hours to clear. 3 feet down, his claws scraped against something hard and metallic. It was a heavy titanium lockbox, sealed with a biometric thumbprint scanner. Daniel pulled it from the earth, wiping the mud from the surface. He looked at Freya. "It requires a sterling." Freya placed her thumb over the scanner. A tiny prick of a needle drew a single drop of blood, a DNA failsafe her father had engineered. The box whirred, clicked, and hissed as the pressurized seal broke open. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were 3 thick leather-bound ledgers, a stack of encrypted bank drives, and a handwritten letter. Freya carefully unfolded the letter. Her father's neat, tactical handwriting filled the page. "To whoever unearths this, hopefully my beloved Freya, when you are old enough to understand, the Eastern Ridge Pack is compromised. Alpha DuPont has sold our borders to human mercenaries through Silverton Reyes Logistics. He plans to assassinate the king and frame me to ensure the tactical division falls under his command. The proof of his treason, his wire transfers, and his orders to the rogues are in these ledgers. Do not trust the council. Trust only the wolves who remember the old ways." "The wire transfers," Daniel growled, flipping through the first ledger. His eyes scanned the precise, undeniable records of millions of dollars moving from DuPont accounts to known rogue syndicates. "He paid them to slaughter my father. He paid them to slaughter our people." The sheer volume of evidence was staggering. It wasn't just a frame job. It was a hostile corporate and military takeover of the Lycan monarchy, disguised as a tragedy. Suddenly, a sharp, unnatural sound pierced the serene quiet of the sanctuary. It was the heavy, rhythmic thud of rotor blades slicing through the fog. Daniel's head snapped up, his ears flattening. Helicopter. Military grade. 2 blinding spotlights cut through the mist, illuminating the clementine ash in harsh, artificial white light. The heavy downdraft whipped the silver leaves into a frenzy. "They tracked us," Ryan yelled over the deafening roar, covering his face from the flying debris. "I took Declan's analog car," Daniel roared back, his fangs descending as his body began the painful, rapid shift toward his partial lichen form. "There were no trackers. They didn't track the car, Your Majesty," a voice boomed through a megaphone from the edge of the tree line. 4 heavily armored SUVs smashed through the perimeter fencing, their high beams pinning Daniel, Freya, and Ryan against the massive trunk of the tree. The doors slammed open, and a dozen heavily armed mercenaries poured out, wielding rifles loaded with silver nitrate rounds. From the lead SUV stepped Gideon DuPont. He was Cassandra's older brother, a hulking, scarred brute who served as the Eastern Ridge's chief enforcer. He held a glowing tablet in his hand, a cruel, mocking smile stretching across his face. "We tracked the king," Gideon sneered, tossing the tablet onto the hood of his vehicle. Did you really think my father would let you wear a custom tuxedo tailored by our people without weaving a micro GPS thread into the lining of the trousers? You've been on our radar since you left the ballroom. Daniel pushed Freya behind him, his chest rumbling with a terrifying subsonic growl that vibrated the very ground beneath their feet. He had shed his ruined shirt, but he was still wearing the tuxedo trousers. Gideon, Daniel snarled, his eyes glowing a brilliant, lethal gold. You are committing high treason against your king. You're not a king anymore, Daniel. Gideon laughed, racking the slide of his silver-loaded assault rifle. You're a rogue who kidnapped a poor, disgraced Omega and murdered a guard in a manic, dark magic-induced frenzy. That's the story Cassandra is telling the council right now. By sunrise, my father will be voted in as the interim Alpha King, and you three will be buried in the dirt with Arthur Sterling's secrets. Gideon raised his hand, signaling the mercenaries to take aim. Kill them all. Burn the tree to the ground. Freya clutched the ledgers to her chest, her heart hammering wildly. But as she looked at Daniel's broad back, standing as an impenetrable shield between her and a dozen guns, she didn't feel fear. The mate bond flared, a blinding, white-hot inferno in her mind. She wasn't just a botanist anymore. She was the fated Luna of the most powerful alpha in a century, and she refused to watch her mate die in the dirt. Daniel, Freya whispered, her silver eyes glowing with a sudden, feral light as she reached out and placed her hand flat against his spine. Let them come, the Alpha King roared. The moment Freya's palm pressed flat against the scarred expanse of Daniel's spine, the world seemed to hold its breath. The mate bond, previously a warm current, erupted into a supernova of golden, kinetic force. It was not just an emotional tether. It was an ancient, biological amplifier designed by the moon goddess to protect the apex of their species. Daniel's roar shook the damp needles from the surrounding pines. His body violently expanded, muscles tearing through the remains of his human clothing as he shifted into his partial lichen form, a terrifying, 8-foot-tall hybrid of man and wolf, coated in midnight black fur with eyes that burned like twin suns. Fire! Put him down! Gideon screamed, leveling his customized Sig Sauer MCX assault rifle. A deafening barrage of gunfire shattered the serenity of the sanctuary. Dozens of silver nitrate rounds tore through the mist, aimed directly at the Alpha King. But the mercenaries had fundamentally miscalculated two things: the speed of a fully bonded alpha and the defensive anomaly of Arthur Sterling's greatest creation. As the bullets flew, the downdraft from the hovering mercenary helicopter whipped the sweeping, silver leaves of the clementine ash into a blinding vortex. The moonlight reflecting off the genetically modified botanical silver acted like a massive strobe light, instantly overloading and shorting out the expensive, military-grade night vision goggles worn by Gideon's men. Blinded and disoriented, the mercenaries fired wildly into the trunk of the tree. The roots, thick as steel cables, absorbed the impact, protecting Freya and Ryan, who crouched securely in the Earth's natural cradle, clutching the waterproof Swiss UBS encrypted drives and the leather ledgers. Daniel moved faster than human eyes could track. He was a shadow of vengeance tearing through the fog. He didn't bother with strategic disarming. He was pure, primal fury. He struck the first mercenary with enough force to shatter the man's Kevlar plating, sending him flying into the hood of an SUV. He ripped the rifle from another, snapping the reinforced barrel in half like a dry twig, before throwing the heavy metal into the rotor blades of the low-hanging helicopter. Sparks showered the clearing as the chopper's engine whined in distress, forcing the pilot to sharply pull up and retreat into the cloud cover, abandoning the ground crew. Within 90 seconds, 11 highly trained, Constellus-vetted mercenaries lay groaning or unconscious in the mud. Only Gideon remained. Panic completely erased the cruel smirk from Gideon's face. He backed away, his boots slipping in the wet earth, frantically trying to reload his jammed weapon. Daniel stalked toward him, the heavy thud of his clawed feet vibrating through the soil. The Alpha King's black fur was matted with rain and the blood of his enemies, but he was entirely uninjured. The golden energy from Freya's touch still pulsed visibly beneath his skin, rendering the ambient silver dust in the air completely harmless to him. "Wait!" Gideon choked out, dropping his useless rifle and raising his hands in a pathetic display of surrender. "Daniel, please. My father ordered this. I was just following the Alpha's command." Daniel closed the distance in a single bound, his massive, clawed hand wrapping around Gideon's throat. He lifted the hulking enforcer 3 feet off the ground, Gideon's legs kicking uselessly in the air. "Your father is no Alpha." Daniel's voice was a terrifying, dual-layered rumble, man and beast speaking as one. "And you are out of time. Before Daniel could snap the traitor's neck, a booming voice echoed over a loudspeaker from the sky. "Stand down. By order of the Royal Guard, drop your weapons." A massive Sikorsky UA-60 Black Hawk helicopter painted in the matte black and silver crest of the Royal Fleet descended rapidly into the clearing, its powerful searchlights pinning Gideon's remaining SUVs. The side doors slid open, and a dozen elite Royal Guards rappelled to the ground, heavily armed and moving with precise, lethal efficiency. Leading them was Declan Hayes. Declan sprinted toward the tree, taking in the carnage, the unconscious mercenaries, and the terrifying, magnificent form of his fully shifted king. "Your Majesty!" Declan shouted over the roar of the rotors. He stopped a respectful distance away, lowering his weapon. "We detected an unauthorized, encrypted micro-GPS frequency pinging from your Royal Wardrobe servers to the Eastern Ridge estate. We traced the relay here. I apologize for the delay." Daniel's glowing eyes flicked from the struggling Gideon to Declan, then finally to the base of the tree. Freya stepped out from the protective roots, her emerald dress ruined, covered in mud and silver dust, but her posture was uncompromisingly regal. She held her father's ledgers tightly against her chest. Daniel slowly exhaled, the beast receding just enough to return to his human form, though his amber eyes remained feral. He dropped Gideon into the mud. "Arrest him," Daniel ordered Declan, gesturing to the gasping DuPont heir. "Bind him with silver chains. We have a banquet to crash." 2 hours later, the grand ballroom of the Obsidian estate was in a state of chaotic transition. The music had stopped. Alpha DuPont stood at the elevated royal dais, flanked by his daughter Cassandra, addressing the panicked crowd of regional leaders. "We must maintain order," Alpha DuPont shouted, banging his fist on the podium. "The king has succumbed to a dark magic hex, placed by the traitor Sterling's daughter. He has murdered a guard and fled. As the strongest regional alpha, I am invoking the emergency succession clause." The massive, reinforced oak doors of the ballroom did not just open. They were violently blown off their iron hinges, crashing to the marble floor with a sound like a bomb detonating. The entire room went dead silent. Daniel Rochester strode into the ballroom. He was shirtless, covered in mud, rain, and dried blood, radiating an aura of absolute, crushing dominance that immediately forced half the room to their knees. Beside him walked Freya Sterling, holding her head high, completely unbothered by the stares of the elite. And behind them, Declan Hayes and the Royal Guard dragged a heavily chained, bruised Gideon DuPont. "The only thing you are invoking, DuPont," Daniel's voice was dangerously calm, carrying easily to the back of the silent room, "is your own execution." Cassandra screamed as Declan threw her brother to the floor at the base of the dais. Alpha DuPont's face drained of all color. "This is an outrage. He is bewitched. Guards, seize them." None of the guards moved. Daniel walked straight up to the dais. He took the heavy, waterproof UBS-encrypted drives and the weathered leather ledgers from Freya's hands and slammed them onto the podium right in front of DuPont. "The financial records of Silverton Reyes Logistics," Daniel announced to the frozen crowd. "Detailed logs of wire transfers to rogue mercenary factions. Signed orders orchestrating the breach that killed my father. All hidden by Arthur Sterling, a true loyalist who died because he discovered your treason." Daniel turned his blazing amber eyes onto the trembling Alpha. "Your reign is over." The aftermath was swift and merciless. The arrests. Alpha DuPont and Cassandra were immediately stripped of their titles and dragged to the very holding cells Freya had occupied hours before, pending a tribunal for high treason. The exoneration. Ryan Montgomery was brought before the council, his testimony clearing Arthur Sterling's name completely. The Sterling family estate and all seized assets were posthumously restored. The reckoning. The Eastern Ridge Pack was placed under the temporary governance of Declan Hayes until a new, loyal leadership could be established. As the dawnlight began to filter through the stained glass windows of the Obsidian estate, the ballroom was finally cleared of the chaos. Only the inner circle remained. Queen Dowager Eleanor sat in her high-backed chair, her blind eye closed, her good eye resting warmly on Freya. "The moon does not make mistakes," the old woman murmured, a satisfied smile on her wrinkled face. Daniel stood by the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the damp, pine-heavy forests of his territory. He turned as Freya approached him. She had finally been given a warm velvet cloak to replace her ruined silk dress. He reached out, pulling her gently against his chest. The adrenaline of the night had faded, leaving only the deep, resonant hum of their permanent bond. "I told you," Freya whispered, resting her head against his racing heart. You just had to trust the wolves who remember the old ways. Daniel buried his face in her hair, inhaling the scent of petrichor and cedarwood that now perfectly mirrored his own. I trust you, Freya. From this night until my last breath. He pulled back just enough to look into her striking silver eyes, the eyes of a tactician's daughter who had saved a kingdom. My fated Luna. She sat alone at the banquet, transitions from a tale of isolation and prejudice into a high-stakes thriller about exposing systemic corruption. By grounding the fantasy elements like the genetically modified Clementine Ash and the explosive power of the mate bond with real-world tactical details and corporate espionage, the story creates a visceral, believable drama. Freya Sterling doesn't just survive through royal decree. She actively rescues the monarchy using her father's hidden intelligence and her own unyielding bravery. Ultimately, the narrative proves that true power doesn't lie in hoarded wealth or stolen titles, but in the unbreakable loyalty of a fated bond and the courage to unearth buried truths.